Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's guest is Julie Lythcott-Haims. Her newest book, called Your Turn: How to Be an Adult, was just wonderful. I just spent the last week reading it and I really loved it. We talk about that book in our conversation and about how it's not just for the 20-somethings, but it's really, there's so much in her newest book about how to be a good person and have a good life. And I just enjoyed it immensely. We also talked about how to raise kids so that they don't need a book where they learn how to be an adult. We raise kids that are prepared for their adult life. And Julie shared some really, really great tips for us. And we also had a really emotional conversation about seeing our children. I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Julie as much as I did. It was so wonderful, and I hope that she and I keep in touch. I enjoyed her so much and our conversation. Julie Lythcott-Haims believes in humans and is deeply interested in what gets in our way. Her work encompasses writing, speaking, teaching, mentoring, and activism. She is the New York Times bestselling author of How to Raise an Adult, which gave rise to a popular TED Talk. Her second book is the critically acclaimed and award-winning prose poetry memoir, Real American, which illustrates her experience as a Black and biracial person in white spaces. Her third book, the one we're talking about mostly today, is called Your Turn: How to Be an Adult, and it's been called a groundbreakingly frank guide to adulthood. Honestly, just as I said, it's not just for new adults. There's something in there for all of us. Julie holds degrees from Stanford, Harvard Law, and California College of the Arts. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her partner of over 30 years, their itinerant young adults, and her mother. Oh, and before we get going, I just wanted to tell you about a great opportunity. Julie's publisher has graciously offered us a couple of copies of her newest book to give away. And to win a copy, to be entered to win a copy, you can share this episode, screenshot it, share it to Instagram or share it to Facebook, and tag me, as well as then sending a screenshot of the share to me either in my Instagram DMs, which is at Sarah Rosensweet, or to my Facebook Messenger, Sarah Rosensweet. So once again, share the episode, tag me, screenshot your share, and then send it to me, and I will enter you into the draw. Now let's really dive in. Hi, Julie. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks to all your listeners for spending time with us today.
I know they're going to love it. I feel like I just spent the past week with you as I read your book. I really enjoyed it. And it's a big fat book. And It's really, you know what I really loved about it? It felt a bit like a memoir. Like I did feel like I got to know you over the course of the book. And I know you have actually written a memoir, but this felt like a memoir as well.
I'm glad. I really am trying to show up in this book, Your Turn, with vulnerability, telling my own stories, stuff that I've learned, maybe the hard way, stuff that I might have been embarrassed to talk about when it happened in my 20s or 30s. But here I am, 53. I think I just turned 54, actually, able to say, like, this happened and it was hard, but turned into a learning opportunity for me. And now I can offer you the advice that I learned the hard way. So yeah, there's a lot of memoir in this book. I'm trying to demonstrate that when we're able to be vulnerable and tell our own stories, we can create greater connections with our fellow human being.
Yeah, it had the feeling of, you and I are almost the same age, but I had the feeling of I'd found a new mentor. And I think that's partly of what you had been trying to get across in the book.
Oh, wow. I appreciate that. It's hard in a book format to create relationship. If you and I were meeting, we could connect and talk and share and feel each other's emotions as we share. In a book, it's a one-way conversation, but I do work hard with my language choice, with my turn of phrase. I am trying to create that close, intimate, caring, seeing you, feeling you, even though I can't know who's reading the book. I'm trying to write with an empathy that helps the reader feel that they matter to me. And
I
so
think you nailed it.
I really appreciate that. It's certainly what I was hoping for.
Obviously, I've read it, you wrote it. People who are listening probably aren't super
Right.
familiar with the book yet, but
Hmm.
can you tell us a little bit about the book and about why did you decide to write this book? Why this book? Why now?
Yeah. So Your Turn is an offering to anybody who's feeling, I don't know how to adult. I don't know if I'm doing it right. I don't want to adult. Adulting is scary. I wrote this book in response to the fact that an entire generation of folk known as millennials began saying those very phrases a decade ago. I heard those phrases and my heart just leapt, with concern. Like, wait a minute, what's up? What's up? You're fine. It's okay. Like, you're going to do this. I felt this compassion for a generation that seemed to feel inadequate at the task of simply entering the next stage of life that happens after you survive childhood. And so it's a response to that concern that many millennials have expressed, and now older Gen Zs are expressing it. And it's born out of my love of humans. I'm trying to help people on their path in life. Adulting is simply the phase of life, as I've said, you enter if you survive childhood, and it is where you will be until you die. So, adulting is really living, no longer the responsibility of someone else. And it's a huge set of decades, and there's a whole lot going on. And it is complex and terrifying at times. And it's also amazing and wonderful, even in hard times. And so, I'm trying to be a companion to a whole slew of people. I'm trying to reassure, trying to give some advice, trying to give some inspiration, and ultimately the sense that you've got this. Believe it or not, you've got this. Keep going.
So it's sort of an advice book, but also to make people feel like they don't need advice in a certain way, like a confidence building book.
Nice. I like that.
Hmm. Do you think that this book is a product of the time that we're in now? Like, do you think this book was needed, like, not this exact book, obviously, but a book like it, like 50 years ago or 75 years ago? Or do you think there's something about today that makes this book necessary?
Well, I think it's both. Humans have been telling humans how to be human since humans were humans. We've always passed on stories from one generation to the next. That's a timeless truth. You think about poetry and heroes' journeys told throughout time. We've always yearned for clues about how to be ourselves by listening to the stories of others. So, in some ways, I have just joined that effort. I am the latest person to try to offer good advice and guidance and support and inspiration. But our current moment is one that is bewildering with a pandemic and climate catastrophe and widening income inequality and systemic racialized violence. We have a lot of meta, macro level, systemic, existential problems. And so I think it is a time for tremendous introspection at the level of the self. Who am I? What do I want? How am I going to survive this? How am I going to make this situation better in my own immediate life, in my extended family, in my neighborhood, in my community, in my country, in my world? I think this is a time that is a call to action for all of us of any age. I think young people are really yearning right now, if they're not completely depressed, which so many of them are, and rightly so because of the pandemic, if they're able to contemplate tomorrow and next week and next month and next year, they want to know what they're going to do to make things better. And I think this book tries to meet them in that moment.
Yeah, my oldest son is 21, and I know he feels that he talks about the existential angst of living in that all of the problems that you just listed off so beautifully. And what I really like about the book is this sort of gives you a bit of a roadmap to feeling what you can do. I think that you even say that in the book at some point, like instead of thinking what can't I do, what can I do? And every chapter has so many brilliant tips and ideas of what you can do. So just asking for a friend, though, how would you get a 21-year-old to read this
To read
book?
this long book. It's funny because my own kids are 22 and 20. And so I'm right there with you in terms of raising people of that age and stage. I think the way to get a 21-year-old to read it is to have had another 21-year-old read it and hand it to them, right?
Hmm.
Word of mouth.
Maybe his
Um,
girlfriend would read it.
his
And
girl. So let me tell you, I am hearing from young people who have read it and they go, I have gotten a handwritten note from a 24-year-old who says, I need to tell you what this book is doing for me. And he says, I know my handwriting is terrible, but I feel I owe you a handwritten note to tell you what this book means. But I've also sent a typed version of my handwritten note in case you can't read my handwriting. I mean, this 24-year-old guy in Massachusetts wrote me that. And that just warmed my heart because I was like, okay, he's read it. He's ingested it. He's going to all these lengths to do the courtesy of telling the author, this book matters to me. That kind of experience happening, I know he's going to tell his friends. I know that makes it more likely that those friends will pick up the book more so than their parent telling them you need to read this book, right? I'm starting to see enough young adults resonate with it that I'm hoping that through word of mouth, they'll be like, I know it's long, but you know what? I feel like she's right there with me, caring about me, rooting for me. You've got to read this book.
Okay, I'm gonna give it to his girlfriend. She's new enough that to impress me, maybe she'll read it and then tell it to read it.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the opening chapter, like it's bit by bit. I would say, like, I've read this book and it really speaks to me about your generation. And so, can you do me a favor and read just the intro, 2-page intro?
See what you
Maybe
think.
chapter 1, see what you think.
Yeah. Okay. I'll get back to you on that.
Okay.
And they're both, both my son and his girlfriend are both deep in what you call fending right now. And I just think I remember that myself. Yeah. I remember calling my parents when I was like 21. I was on a backpacking trip by myself in Scotland. I discovered on the trip I hate traveling by myself. I like being by myself, but I hate traveling by myself. It was pouring rain. I was camping. And I just remember calling my parents and being like, I'm so miserable. And that's sort of the low side of fending. But maybe you could talk a little bit about fending. That was one thing that really stood out to me. And also, I think as our audience, a lot of my listeners are parents of children who are not yet out in the world. And so maybe we could talk about fending a little bit in the context of what fending is, and then how can you best prepare your kids for that when they do get to that fending stage.
Yeah. So I'm going to get really scientific for a moment, even though I'm not a scientist. So scientists who are listening, forgive me. I want to remind our community of listeners today that we are mammals, and we are mammals who wear fancy clothes and carry cell phones and drive vehicles. But like every mammal species, our job is to be with our young for a period of time appropriate to our species, teach them all the things while feeding them and sheltering them and protecting them, teach them all the things so that one day they can do for themselves. They can fend for themselves. It's in contemplation of our own death, right? One day we won't be here to make them food and tie their shoes and wipe their butts. Like one day they have to do all of these things. And childhood is supposed to be the period of time where slowly but surely we transition from us doing it all to them being able to do most of it. Okay. That's what it means to no longer be a child. Nowadays, too many of us wrap our sense of self as a parent around, I handle every little thing for my child. There are people bathing their kids too long. There are people cutting their kids' food too long. There are people wiping their kids' behinds too long, holding their hands to cross the street too long. It comes out of love. I can do it. It's easier if I do it. Of course, I love them. I'll handle it. What's your long-term strategy? Okay. You have forgotten that at some point they will be 15 or 18 or 21 or 25. And the thing you think you're lovingly helping them with has now become a hindrance because they haven't had the chance to practice it for themselves. And that 16-year-old whose meat you're still cutting, and I had a mom tell me this a couple months ago, he's now out at a work lunch and he's sticking his fork into the entire piece of meat and lifting it to his mouth like Fred Flintstone. And his peers but laugh, and his boss looks askance, and that's your fault. All right? You're supposed to have taught a kid to cut food back when they're 8. Okay? So fending is the basics, Sarah. It's, can you take care of your body? Can you take care of your belongings? Can you take care of your bills? I call it taking care of business. It's the basics. It's not, I'm going to be president of the whatever one day, or I'm going to have an amazing car. No. It's the basics. Are you capable? Barring significant disabilities, fending for oneself means I can get myself up, get myself washed and dressed. I can feed myself. The place in which I'm living, I am paying for it somehow, right? I am responsible for my shelter, my food, my belongings, my bills. I can get myself where I need to go for work and to be in community with others. I am accountable to myself, taking care of my own needs. I want to put a huge asterisk here. I'm not at all saying everyone has to go it alone, right? This is, you just know I can do these things. You will also have people in your life, family, loved ones, friends, coworkers, etc., who will be there for you, and they're essential. But each of us, as a matter of rootedness in this life, as a matter of agency, we need to know I am capable of taking care of business for myself. That's fending.
My son, when he just moved into he was a little late moving out because of COVID and all of that, but he just moved out in September into his own apartment, and he said, "Mom, I had to teach my roommates how to do dishes."
Yeah.
None of them, 20 years old, none of them had ever done dishes before.
Yeah.
It was a bit shocking.
Yeah, all the things.
Mhm.
Dishes, laundry. How do you know how to purchase groceries in a way that's efficient, right? They've got to learn. Fruit goes bad. Things get
Mhm.
moldy. That chicken, if you don't cook it in 4 days, is going to stink up the refrigerator, right? These are things they're supposed to learn. Every one of us has to learn that. We learn it in childhood. We start to practice it in adulthood. And at some point, we don't have fruit and food rotting constantly because we've figured it out. We've figured out the frequency of when do we shop and what do we shop for. Can I just offer there is a 4-step method for teaching any kid any skill. And it gets to this is how we teach them to fend. We don't just carry them through life in our arms and then set them down on the sidewalk and expect them to be able to walk. Okay, that would be cruel. Okay, there's a 4-step method. It's first you do it for them, which we're very good at. Number 2, then you do it with them. They're there. You're kind of narrating out loud what you're doing in your teacher voice, slowing it down a little so they can see the steps, but you're still handling it. Step 3, you watch them do it. You turn the tables, right? You're there just in case so they don't set the house on fire as they make that sandwich on the gas stove, right? You're there in the kitchen just in case. Step 4, they can do it alone without you there. We're supposed to be doing step 1, 2, 3, 4 for everything that constitutes fending for yourself.
I love that, and that's from your book, How to Raise an Adult, which I
That's
would
right.
highly recommend to anyone, which is your second book, and I was thinking of that recently, teaching my 17-year-old how to drive. It's a
Nice.
perfect example, right? But
Yeah.
from any learning how to tie shoes, to cooking, to learning how to drive, yeah, I think that a lot of parents do get stuck on the doing it for them, and as you said, it's out of love, and I think that sometimes us nurturers do a lot, but I was always careful to try and make sure that they could do it, even if and even one of my kids in high school, my oldest said, "Mom, I can make my own lunch, right?" And I was like, "I know, but I just want to take a little something off your plate. So I'm happy to make your lunch." And, my youngest, who's 14, half the time she makes her lunch, half the time I make it, depending on if I feel like it or not, as
Yeah.
my caretaking hormones are decreasing as I get older.
Yeah. I love that. My 22-year-old is living with us as a result of the pandemic, works for our local school district as an aide for kids with special needs. And I realize I've been over helping this kid a lot in life. He has some sensitivities. My husband and I would walk on eggshells around his sensitivities and just try to handle and fix things. And we've learned by reading the work of psychologist Ali Leibowitz at Yale that when we over accommodate their fears and needs, we can end up fomenting anxiety in our children because it's like, oh, my parents agree that this is a terrible thing and they're going to make sure it never happens or they're going to make sure I never experience it. And that can lead to anxiety. And so we've been unpacking that in family therapy, which I highly, highly value and recommend to anyone who has an inkling that you might need it. My instinct would be when my son is having a tough morning and is going to be late for work, I think he's going to be late for work. I want to swoop in and fix it. Let me make your breakfast. Let me make your lunch. And that turns out to undermine his sense that he can, right? So what I'm supposed to do is say, oh my gosh, it looks like you've had a rough start this morning. Let me know if I can help. And let him have the agency to say, that would be great, Mom. Is there any way you can make my lunch? Yes. Or, nope, thanks, I've got it. And more often than not, he wants to know he's got it. He wants to know we know he's got it. So when I say, it looks like it's a rough morning, let me know if I can help. More often than not, my son will be like, thanks, Mom, appreciate it. I've got it. And that reinforces for him that he knows he can do it, that he knows we know he can do it. My past tendency to reach in and handle it would have undermined that agency he is working so hard to develop. being responsible for himself, being accountable for the fact that he did get up late. Sometimes he will want help, like, oh my gosh, it is a disaster. Thank you so much, right? But to let him be the one outside of a true emergency where he's not able to advocate for himself, that is to be respectful of the adult that he is.
Yeah, I don't know if you know the work of Lynn Lyons. She's an anxiety specialist. She's a psychologist that I follow. She's really wonderful, but she talks about letting kids solve their own problems as being like almost inoculation. It's one of the things she talks about as being an inoculation against anxiety, because they do have to know, I can figure this out, right? That they have that agency, that they have that, are developing that sense of mastery to figuring out their own lives. And she also talks about that, that when kids are in an uncomfortable spot, that desire we have to fix it, or, help them avoid the things that make them anxious or upset is, as you said, kind of locks in that anxiety. But then there's also the other end of the spectrum of leaving kids to flounder, and then they also feel helpless. So it's that middle ground you're talking about. Let me know if I can do anything to help, which lets them figure it out on their own, but also gives them a little bit of a safety net, which is so important as kids are growing up, to feel like we've got their back. But I just love that. I love that all of my people are coming in at this with the same messages.
Tell me her name again. I'm writing it down.
Lynn Lyons.
Okay. I'll get the link maybe from you.
Yeah.
Sounds like somebody I want to learn more about, and I appreciate your mentioning her. And I want to say, back to your turn for a second, I believe it's chapter 6. It's sort of the middle of the book where I talk about how to get unstuck. I call it get out of neutral. And I'm raising this now because I make the point in chapter 6 that you may be feeling stuck in your young adulthood if you have been overhelped, if you haven't had this sort of delicious feeling of mastery, persisting at something, proving to yourself that you can. As Kelly McGonigal puts it, there's no greater buzz in the world than solving your own problem, right? If you've been deprived of that because you've had very well-meaning, over-involved caretakers, you may be stuck in your young adulthood because you quite literally don't know how to handle the stuff that's in front of you, because someone else has always kind of been there to swoop in. So I say in the book, if this is you, like, these are childhood patterns coming home to roost, doesn't mean they can't be undone, but knowing that may be a source of my stuckedness is, I think, of value to a young adult.
Absolutely. And even some older adults.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one thing I really liked about the book is I feel like I know it's written for young adults coming into their own, but there really is something for everyone in it.
Yeah.
And, I have to say one of my favorite things, and I think I've realized you and I are similar this way, I love the stories, the people's stories. And I think, a great part of the reason why I got into the work that I do is because I'm sort of an inherently curious person about people's stories. And I just loved the stories. They were so wonderful and inspiring. And I loved how you brought in stories from people from all walks of life. Like, really and truly, it was really, anyone listening, the book is worth it just for the stories of the people.
Nice. I'm so grateful that that piece mattered to you. Sarah, at the outset, you noted that it felt like a memoir. And I acknowledge, yes, I have my own stories in there. And there's a lot of self-help tips, 9 tips for this, 16 tips for this, a lot of practical for the people who just like, tell me what to do. But every chapter ends with stories of 3 or 4 other people, as you've said, from all walks of life. And I really went to quite an effort to try to be incredibly inclusive of humans who are from all walks of life. And I mean that around race and gender identity and sexual orientation and socioeconomic circumstance and degree of education and mental health situation and religion. And what I'm trying to show is, first of all, I am hoping every reader will have a cause at some point in the book to say, my gosh, this sounds so much like me. Like Julie was thinking of me as she wrote this. Too many books don't contemplate all readers. They contemplate a narrow slice. And I have been that reader as a Black and biracial and queer person, excluded from the narrative that purports to want to help me, but doesn't seem to see me or my life experience. So as an author, as a matter of craft, I'm determined to be inclusive. And so I'm trying to point out the differences, and yet in so doing, to point out the inherent similarities, because maybe you find yourself relating to someone talking about anxiety or depression or bipolar or cancer or struggling to get their first job, and you relate to that undertaking or that effort or that trauma. And yet demographically, you're so different from this person. So this book is also serving up this message in a broken human moment. Look, y'all, we're all the same. And
Hmm.
yet we have differences that are valid. So I am trying to achieve that through the storytelling. And I'm really glad that the storytelling appealed to you.
When I was an English major way back when, I remember being taught the more specific you get, the more universal it becomes.
Right.
And I think that's what you did in your book, right?
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
exactly what I was going for. Thank you
Yeah.
for putting it in terms of literary craft and so
That
much.
English degree comes in handy
It was.
sometimes.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to ask you one thing that I think my audience would really appreciate hearing more about, and since it's in your book, I'm assuming you'd be comfortable sharing, is this story that you told about Sawyer and his challenges with, that you didn't realize really until he was quite a bit older, how much he had been struggling when he was younger. Do you mind sort of telling that story and then maybe sharing with us if you could have gone back, what maybe you would have done differently or could have done differently, not in as an exercise in blame or shame,
Yeah.
but just as an awareness
For learning.
exercise?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, Sawyer's my 22-year-old, and he gives me permission to talk about this with you and on other podcasts and to put it in the book. So I am well clear of that concern. I think I'm pointing that out because often we parents are sharing our kids' business in the street and not
No,
real,
I always say that too when I talk. I'm
right?
like, and she's given my permission to
Right.
share this with
Exactly.
you.
It's important to model that. So that's why I'm doing that. Yeah. So Sawyer had a diagnosis in the fourth grade of ADHD, inattentive type, not hyperactive, but just losing focus, a little bit of anxiety, and something called dysgraphia, which is trouble getting ideas out through the pen or pencil. And he was so smart and so good and so kind. And so we were like, okay, we sort of thought he'd grow out of it. We didn't want to pathologize him. We didn't want to be that family, that Silicon Valley family that is sort of using diagnoses to get a kid some advantage. There's a lot of that happens. There's misuse of diagnoses or fake diagnoses in our community. I'll just say it. And I didn't want to be perceived as that. He's so bright, and I figured the brightness would overcome the diagnosis. I mean, this all sounds ridiculous. I'm just telling you, honestly, this is where I was. And so, we got him some help and we got him some strategies and this and that, but he was achieving academically is what I'm saying. And so it didn't really seem to matter. He began taking meds for the ADHD in his junior year because homework had become such a bear. He could not concentrate on homework ever. And we would sit with him and try to just like rejostle him and jostle his attention and get him to focus and bounce on a bouncy ball or eat a stick of dark chocolate or something to stimulate him. And this was becoming untenable for me, my husband, and obviously for Sawyer. And he began taking meds after refusing them for years because he didn't want to alter his body chemistry, as he put it. He's a science guy. And the meds helped. And we regretted that. And he regretted, I think, also that he had not tried them sooner because they just brought time back. It meant homework was now 3 hours a night instead of 5. But he still didn't really lean into the diagnosis. Neither did we. Again, he was so bright and so accomplished, etc. He went off to college, a very rigorous small liberal arts college, and began a slow crash and burn of his grades from A's and B's to B's and C's to C's and D's to D's and F's. And he decided to take time away to get things in order. His mental health was suffering as well, and he decided to work and live in his college town. And that summer, when he came home to us before working and living in this college town, my husband and I decided, okay, it's the end of his sophomore year, which he's just tanked. We need to learn about these diagnoses. And we bought, as I like to say, all the books. We bought some books by Ned Hallowell about ADD and some other books. And my husband and I read them voraciously and flagged them up with Post-it notes. And just learned a lot for the first time. And it was like the consequence of the bad grades and the mental health struggle made us want to learn more about the diagnosis. And that's my point of regret. Like, why did it take us that long? Sawyer comes home. He sees all the books flagged up. He's like, Mom, I saw the books. And I thought he was going to be upset. I thought he was going to be upset that we were reading up on him. And instead, Sarah, he said, thanks for taking an interest in understanding who I am. And my soul just cried like, oh my God, my precious son. I have thought I've been interested and lovingly, caringly attentive to you and your needs from the moment I conceived you. And yet, here's evidence that I have not appreciated that these diagnoses are not trivial, are valid, are important, are components of your makeup, and that I need to honor and respect that and learn about those things so that I can support you in this life in the face of these challenges that you have that I don't have. And I put that in the book because I wanted anyone who's been through that to flag that page and hand it to their parent or caregiver and say, "This is me. Let's have this conversation." So, my message to parents is don't ignore the diagnosis, don't wish it away, don't assume they're so smart or capable or whatever that we don't have to care about this. These diagnoses are real and they matter, and everything else is irrelevant without first having focused and honored and respected the diagnoses for what they are. My son is getting great support now. Okay. And he's had a path quite derailed because I think because he didn't get the support he deserved sooner. And I'm proud of the work that he's doing. I've mentioned we're in family therapy. I think I've mentioned that I'm glad that we're doing that to help us understand what are our patterns as a family, as a parent and child dynamic that need to change to support him. So we're doing the work. We are in it, Sarah. And I'm glad, I'm proud of us. But man, I wish that back in the fourth grade and the fifth grade and the sixth and the eighth and the 10th, Dan and I had been less enamored of how brilliant he was and more empathetic about the very present struggles in the day to day that our son was enduring without us really even getting it.
Yeah. There's so many things that I want to pull out of that. My daughter, who also gives me permission to talk about this, has got diagnosed with ADHD about a year and a half ago at age 12. And I'm so grateful that we found that out about her, but also that she is getting really great support in school. And I wonder if enough has changed between her diagnosis and Sawyer's diagnosis that I think back when he was diagnosed, a lot of people didn't believe that ADHD was a thing. Like
Right.
it was like made up, kids are over medicated, just work a little harder and you can overcome. So, I think you should be a little bit easier on yourself
Appreciate that.
because
Yep.
I do think that the view is changing
I
about things
appreciate that.
about neurodiversity, and also that, the I think there's a side being seen now about the beautiful gifts also of neurodivergence. So
Yeah.
I'm really glad that Sawyer has you
Yeah.
for a mom.
Appreciate that. And I do want to say you're 100% right. And when you frame it like that, which nobody really has framed quite as clearly for me, I get it. And I was very much of that moment in a town in Silicon Valley where there was a lot of disbelief slash gaming of the system by some. And here I was, a Stanford dean, a dean at Stanford University down the street from me, very acutely aware that my family's actions were a little bit more public than the average person because I was a little bit well known and so on. So I was sort of trying to model the right way to be. It's weird, but I just didn't want to be misperceived. I'm also African American. And there's all of that narrative about how we don't earn our spot and how we get things the easy way, which is just so damaging and so hard. And I've been overcoming that in my own life. So the last thing I wanted was for my brilliant brown son to be perceived as having been given some kind of advantage
Right.
that he hadn't earned. And that was, he listened to me crying. Like that was definitely in it for me as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just unable to see who he actually was and what he was actually struggling with because I was so worried about other people's perceptions.
Mm-hmm. It's also, I think, helpful to look at it in the context of American capitalism and the American dream. And if you just work hard enough, you can
Right.
get it, right? He just need to work a little harder than that. He's so smart, he'll be able to do it. Like I totally get why you and Dan, because I know Dan now from the
Right.
book,
Yeah.
why you and Dan had the response that you did is completely
Yeah.
understandable.
Yeah, we're in a good place now, and that's what I think I wanna highlight for folks. We are in a place when our journey began to become the parents that Sawyer needed. I would have said to you, we're in it. We're in the thick of it. We're deep in it. Things are tough right now. He's dealing with depression. He's dealing with anxiety. He has climbed out of that hole, and we have learned how to be more effective at supporting. And it goes back to the things you and I were talking about with Lynn Lyon's work and all of that, that sort of supporting without doing for, so that they develop that sense of capacity, capability, confidence, mastery. And it's been a beautiful progression, and I'm proud of us.
I'm proud of you too.
Thank you.
Another thing that occurred to me while you were talking about when, I brought this up as a question to talk about the idea of being able to truly see your children. And when you were talking, I had a flash of like the gay kid who's in the family who's not getting seen for who they are by their parents. And I wonder if sometimes we only see what's familiar to us as parents in our children. Like we have
Yeah,
a hard time seeing, if you hadn't had the experience of inattentive ADHD, it would be a lot harder for you to understand what things were like for Sawyer in his struggles in school, and if somebody grew up straight in a heteronormative society and their kid was gay, and that, maybe that's an old-fashioned example. I don't know. I think we're moving towards a lot more acceptance. But I think that part of seeing our children for who they are is trying to step out of our own experience. And honestly, as I'm talking, like that's what empathy is about, right? It's
right.
about getting into
That's right.
someone
Right.
else's shoes and seeing the world through their eyes, and they're trying to understand their experience, even when it's a lot different from your experience.
Right. I love this insight, and I will agree with you and add that in addition to straight parents of gay kids, there are parents who adopt children of a different race or ethnicity than their own. And so they don't know what it's like to be, of that ethnicity or race walking down the street in their town. And the work that transracial adoptive parents need to do to try to understand what their kids' experience will be is so important. It's another example. And it speaks to why we have to consume media that doesn't just reflect back to us the stories of people who are from our walk of life, whether it's television or movies or listening to podcasts or reading novels or memoirs or what have you. We have to expand our own worldview so that we can take in the fact that other people's lives are different, so that we can be more available to the fact that our child might have an experience that we didn't have. Doesn't make their experience any less relevant or doesn't make it any less important. And as parents, we want to be able to do the work to say to ourselves and to our kids, I haven't trodden this pathway. I'm not queer, or I haven't dealt with depression, or I don't know what it's like to have this particular disability, or I don't know what it's like to be a math whiz, whatever it is. Like, I don't know, but I want to know whatever I need to know to support you in being you and thriving. So I'm open to whatever you want to share with me about your experience. And please know that, and this now applies to the workplace. We're trying to help employees thrive. And we want to know like who's not thriving and why. We may not be able to relate to the reason somebody is having a hard time, but to express that careful, kind curiosity without it being fetishizing. Like, I'd like to know more about your experience if you're willing to share so that I can support you where I need to. And I can't know your experience because it isn't mine, but it's my job to care about you. So I'm here. I'm always here when you want to talk about what you're going through because I want to be of use to you on your journey.
That's beautiful. I'm sort of on a similar, just starting out baby steps on a journey of trying to unpack race and financial privilege within the peaceful parenting context. And there's a lot of really interesting voices of people who are talking about, gentle parenting, peaceful parenting, positive parenting, whatever you want to call it, and how it's, so much more accessible to people who have privilege, right? Whatever kind of privilege, whether it's white privilege or financial privilege or whatever kind of privilege it is. And I'm grateful to another person you might want to check out if you don't know her already, Yolanda Williams of Parenting Decolonized, for really helping to be such a voice in the conscious parenting world about privilege. And I don't know, we're all in this together, but we all need to know a little bit more about where everyone else is coming from, whether it's on a family level or workplace level or, the parenting sphere.
Wow, that was beautiful. I'm glad that you're interested in unpacking that privilege. We're all getting so much better at that. I mean, I have the privilege of being on a lot of podcasts, and so I'm a part of a lot of conversation. And I'm watching how the conversation, the questions have changed, and the awareness we all have come to in a greater sense fairly recently. I know a lot of folks have been there for a long time, but there are a lot of folks who are newly appreciating this concept of privilege and how it makes us unaware. And look, I've told you I'm Black, biracial, and queer. I'm also upper middle class. highly educated with 2 graduate degrees. I live in a very expensive part of the country. And so I can write a narrative as I have my memoir. I'm dealing with racism and microaggressions at the same time. I will acknowledge, yeah, and I'm somebody who quote made it. I had every opportunity, and yet racism still found me. And so I really try to be aware, like I'm not talking about suffering in the way that someone is suffering if they lack food and shelter, if they're being abused, if they don't have the means to pay their most basic bills. I'm conscious that I have to contextualize whatever I'm saying is hard about my life within the larger human context of where struggle is quite prevalent.
Julie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. And now I feel like I really do know you a little bit, not just like my idea of feeling like I know you from the book. I always ask one question of all my podcast guests, and that is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what message or advice would you give yourself as a new parent?
I'm going to answer that, but now I'm stalling for time. I'm not really stalling for time. I'm joking. I just want to say, because I know we're wrapping up, I want to say to all the listeners, thanks for being here. You've stuck through a conversation that has had a lot of emotion in it, been some storytelling. If anything came up for you, I hope you'll take note of what it was, because that's a little clue from yourself that maybe something you heard is important to you. To answer your question, I would say own my authority as a parent. I was the indulgent permissive type, which is the just wants to make everything easy and fun and everything is good, didn't have a lot of expectations, didn't have a lot of rules. I was never going to be the authoritarian, but that is the opposite of what I'm describing. All the rules and none of the feelings. I was all of the feelings and none of the rules. My kids were well behaved. They didn't need a lot of rules, but we were always trying to say yes. And it meant that our kids never had to deal with the no's. And I think I was afraid to claim my authority. I think I was afraid that they wouldn't listen to me, which is ridiculous. I realize in hindsight, in therapy, we've learned, when the therapist's like, what would happen if you told Sawyer that, this is an expectation? My husband and I was like, well, what if he doesn't follow it? And the therapist's like, you think Sawyer's not going to listen to you? Whew. So I was afraid to stand in my spot, as my friend Ole Jorgensen and Sherry Glukoft Wong put it in their forthcoming book, Claim Your Spot. There are issues we would never compromise on, like you got to wear a seatbelt. Well, turns out there are more things like that in family life, in the upbringing of children, where we have to be that clear. We wouldn't say, oh, it's fine. You don't have to wear a seatbelt. There's just one time. No. So we've got to hold some boundaries around things like bedtimes and around things like food and things like what gets done when and so on. I would have stood in my spot and taken a deep breath and felt I have the right and responsibility as their parent to set some parameters around all of this, boundaries, rules, that makes children feel safe. And they know what's up. They know what's going on.
Yeah.
They know what crosses the line and what doesn't.
We talk about that in Peaceful Parenting, the importance of kind, firm limits. Can I just ask you a follow-up about that? You said that you thought it was because you were afraid they would not follow it.
Yeah.
Although I wonder, because this is what I see with a lot of my clients, especially clients who work a lot, they have such limited time with their kids that they don't want to make them unhappy in the time that they have together. Do you think that was at all part of?
I think it was both. I definitely did not want to make them unhappy. Life is easier when our children are happy, right? Family life is easier when our children are happy. This is frankly the equivalent of cutting their food too long. I'll just cut their food because it's quicker if I do it, right? We have limited time. Let me just take care of this. I'll just carry you across the street because we're in a hurry, right? Limited time means we often take these shortcuts and miss teaching the skill or letting the lesson stand or whatever it is because we're in too much of a rush, or we just want everything to be easy and calm and kind in these precious moments we have, where that is a very short-term way of parenting. It overlooks the long-term impact of those short-term easier moments.
For sure. Thank you so much. Can you tell our listeners the best place to connect with you? I know I love getting your pod emails. Or you share with us the best, what you want them to know, and the best way to keep in touch.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I blog weekly at a place I call Julie's Pod, and the URL for that is jlythcott-haims.bulletin.com. And
We'll put it in the show notes.
In a link in the show notes. Thank you. And my website is julielythcott-haims.com, and you can find out more about my books and what I'm about, my website. And follow me everywhere on social at jlythcott-haims. Even
Great.
TikTok.
And I think when this podcast goes to air, your turn will just have come out in paperback.
I'm so
So
excited for that. Yes.
yeah, it'll make the book a little easier to carry around in the satchel for the 21-year-olds who are going to be reading it.
I can't wait to see what this feels like in paperback. We've talked about it being a long book, and it is. And it's just as long in paperback, but it's, I guess, softer.
It was not a hard read, really was not. I mean, it was a very engaging read, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank
So
you.
thank you.
I appreciate you. And thanks to everyone who listened.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Once again, if you want to be entered into a draw to win a copy of Your Turn, How to Be an Adult, share this episode to your favorite social media platform, tag me, and then screenshot your share, send it to me in the DMs, whether it's on Facebook or Instagram. I'm at Sarah Rosensweet, and we will enter you into a draw to win a copy of the book. This contest closes on February 22nd. So get us a screenshot before then, and maybe you'll be one of the lucky winners. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.